Today I'm going to show you how to build a finger joint jig with a few tips that might help you build jigs in general. For this build I have only used leftovers that I had flying around in my shop. This jig is not very different to a crosscut sled. And if you're interested, I have a video on building a crosscut sled as well. But the steps are very similar to this one. First off, you need a base plate. It can be in any size or thickness that you need it to be. In my case, I use an 8mm thick piece of MDF. Now the next step is to build the sliders. And for that, measure out the T-track on your table saw. This might be different for you, but in my case it's 19mm. I would advise to have some spare material for the sliders, because they need to fit perfectly with no plate to the sides, but also not too tight so you can actually slide the sled back and forth. It took 2 attempts to get that right, but it's definitely a step where you don't want to make compromises. Here you can see that I have a little bit of plate to the sides, so I scrapped that piece and made a new one. Here's the first trick. You can't fail the alignment of the sliders when they are in the T-track. And the easiest way to do that is to raise them a little bit with a small square piece and glue them onto the ground plate. Now it's actually time to push the sled through the saw, but not all the way. We're gonna use that and my next little trick to align the fence perfectly. But first we need to prepare the fence. And for that I would recommend taking a slightly larger one. First of all, because it will be easier to move the sled around with it. And secondly, so you can attach your workpiece safely to it later on. Now we need a little cut, exactly the width of your saw blade, somewhere near the middle of the fence. And for that I'm using the crosscut sled I was talking about earlier. Now you could also measure your blade, but I think it's easier to measure out the cut that you just made to find out the width. Now in my case it's 3mm, so I'm gonna set my table saw to this measurement. This might be a little bit tricky, especially when you don't have a zero clearance insert. But you can also not cut all the way through and just cut it out by hand later, which is exactly what I did. Now it's time to glue that little piece into the slot in our fence. This is basically what makes this jig different to the crosscut sled. So this fence needs to be in perfect 90° to the table saw blade. And I also have a little trick for that. And for that you need 3 pieces with the thickness of your table saw blade. One that you can put in the cutout of the ground plate, the second one to set the distance right, and the third one is only to support all the pieces so that everything is in perfect 90° angle. To keep the fence square I held it in place with 2 clamps and then added 2 screws from the bottom. Unfortunately I didn't get a better shot from it, but it's just 2 pre-drilled and countersunk screws. And finally the last step, adding a second fence to the front to give the whole jig more stability. This one is just held in place with some CA glue. Now you can put your workpiece on the jig, set the table saw height to the thickness of your material, and start sawing in all the little fingers. Now one last thing to mention, for this type of joint you have an A and a B side. For the A side you can put the workpiece right in the corner of the jig, and for the B side, turn around the A side, put that in as a little spacer and start cutting in, just like so.